Dear M, I want you to know that it is a very cold day in San Francisco today and that I am freezing. It is so cold in my room that every time I start to write a short story, the cold stops me and I have to get up and do bending exercises. It means, I think, that something's got to be done about keeping short story writers warm. Sometimes, when it is very cold, I am able to do very good writing, but at other times I am not. It is the same when the weather is excessively pleasant. I very much dislike letting a day go by without writing a short story, and that is why I am writing this letter, to let you know that I am very angry about the weather. Do not think that I am sitting in a nice warm room in sunny California, as they call it, and making up all this stuff about the cold. I am sitting in a very cold room, and there's no sun anywhere, and the only thing I can talk about is the cold, because it is the only thing going on today. I'm freezing and my teeth are chattering. I would like to know what the Democratic Party ever did for freezing short story writers. Everybody else gets heat. We've got to depend on the sun, and in the winter the sun is undependable. That's the fix I am in, wanting to write and not being able to because of the cold. One winter day last year, the sun came out and its light came into my room and fell across my table, warming my table in my room and warming me. So I did some brisk bending exercises and then sat down and began to write a short story. But it was a winter day, and before I had written the first paragraph of the story, the sun had fallen back behind clouds, and there I was in my room, sitting in the cold, writing a story. It was such a good story that even though I knew it would never be printed, I had to go on writing it, and as a result, I was frozen stiff by the time I finished writing it. My face was blue, and I could barely move my limbs. They were so cold and stiff. And my room was full of the smoke of a package of Chesterfield cigarettes, but even the smoke was frozen. There were clouds of it in my room, but my room was very cold just the same. Once, while I was writing, I thought of getting a tub and making a fire in it. What I intended to do was to burn a half a dozen of my books and keep warm. I found an old tub, and I brought it to my room, but when I looked around for books to burn, I couldn't find any. All of my books are old and cheap. I have about 500 of them, and I paid a nickel each for most of them, but when I looked around for titles to burn, I couldn't find any. There was a large, heavy book in German on anatomy that would have made a swell fire, but when I opened and read a line of that beautiful language, I couldn't do it. It was asking too much. I couldn't understand the language. I couldn't understand a word in the whole book, but was somehow too eloquent to use for a fire. The book had cost me 5 cents 2 or 3 years ago, and it weighed about 6 pounds. So you see that even as firewood, it had been a bargain. I should have been able to tear out its pages and make a fire. But I couldn't do it. There were over 1,000 pages in the book, and I planned to burn one page at a time and see the fire of each page. But when I thought of it, all that print being effaced by fire, and all that accurate language being removed from my library, I couldn't do it. And I still have the book. When I get tired of reading great writers, I go to this book and I read the language that I cannot understand. But it is simply blasphemous to think of burning 1,000 pages of such language. And of course, I haven't so much as mentioned the marvelous illustrations. Then I began to look around for cheap fiction. And you know, the world is chock full of such stuff. 9 books out of 10 are cheap, worthless fiction, inorganic stuff. I thought, well, there are at least a half a dozen of those books in my library. I can burn them and be warm and write my story. So I picked out 6 books, and together they weighed about the same as the German anatomy book. The first was Tom Brown at Oxford, a sequel to School Days at Rugby, 2 volumes in one. The first book had 378 pages, and the second 430, and all these pages would have been a small fire that would have lasted a pretty long time. But I had never read the book, and it seemed to me that I had no right to burn a book I hadn't even read. It looked as if it ought to be a book of cheap prose, one worthy of being burned, but I couldn't do it. I read, "The belfry tower rocked and reeled as that peal rang out. now merry, now scornful, now plaintive, from those narrow belfry windows into the bosom of the soft southwest wind, which was playing round the old grey tower of Engelborn Church. Now that isn't exactly tremendous prose, but it isn't such very bad prose either. So I put the book back on the shelf. The next book was Inez, A Tale of the Alamo, and it was dedicated to the Texan Patriots. It was by the author of another book called Belua, and yet another called Saint Elmo. The only thing I knew about this writer or her books was that one day a girl at school had been severely reprimanded for bringing to class a book called Saint Elmo. It was said to be the sort of book that would corrupt the morals of a young girl. Well, I opened the book and I read, I am dying, and feeling as I do that few hours are allotted me, I shall not hesitate to speak freely and candidly. Some might think me deviating from the delicacy of my sex, but under the circumstances I feel that I am not. I have loved you long, and to know that my love is returned is a source of deep and utterly joy to me. And so on. This was such bad writing that it was good, and I decided to read the whole book at my first opportunity. There's much for a young writer to learn from our poorest writers. It is very destructive to burn bad books, almost more destructive than to burn good ones. The next book was 10 Nights in a Bar Room and What I Saw There by T.S. Arthur. Well, even this book was too good to burn. The other 3 books were by Hall Caine, Brander Matthews, and Upton Sinclair. I had read only Mr. Sinclair's book, and while I didn't like it a lot as a piece of writing, I couldn't burn it because the print was so fine and the binding so good. Typographically, it was one of my best books. Anyway, I didn't burn a single page of a single book, and I went to freezing and writing. Every now and then I burned a match, just to remind myself what a flame looked like, just to keep in touch with the idea of heat and warmth. It would be when I wanted to light another cigarette, and instead of blowing out the flame, I would let it burn all the way down to my fingers. It is simply this, that if you have any respect for the mere idea of books, what they stand for in life, if you believe in paper and print, you cannot burn any page of any book, even if you're freezing. Even if you're trying to do a bit of writing yourself, you can't do it. It is asking too much. Today is a cold day in my room, as the day I wanted to make a fire of books. I am sitting in the cold, smoking cigarettes, and trying to get this coldness onto paper, so that when it becomes warm again in San Francisco, I won't forget how it was on the cold days. I have a small phonograph in my room, and I play it when I want to exercise in order to keep warm. Well, when it gets to be very cold in my room, this phonograph won't work. Something goes wrong inside. The grease freezes, and the wheels won't turn, and I can't have music while I'm bending and swinging my arms. I've got to do it without music. It is much more pleasant to exercise with jazz, but when it is very cold, the phonograph won't work, and I am in a hell of a fix. I've been in here since 8 o'clock this morning, and it is now 4:45, and I'm in a hell of a mess. I hate to let a day go by without doing something about it, without saying something. And all day I've been in here with my books that I never read, trying to get started, and I haven't gotten anywhere. Most of the time, I've been walking up and down the room. 2 steps in any direction brings you to a wall, and bending and kicking and swinging my arms. That's practically all I've been doing. I tried the phonograph 6 times to see if the temperature hadn't gone up a little, but it hadn't, and the phonograph wouldn't play. I thought I ought to tell you about this. It's nothing important. It's sort of silly, making so much of a little cold weather, but at the same time, the cold is a fact today, and it is the big thing right now, and I am speaking of it. The thing that amazes and pleases me is that my typewriter hasn't one clock today. Around Christmas, when we had a very cold spell out here, it was always clogging, and the more I oiled it, the more it clogged. I couldn't do a thing with it. The reason was that I had been using the wrong kind of oil. But all this time that I've been writing about the cold, my typewriter has been doing its work excellently. And this amazes me and pleases me. To think that in spite of cold, this machine can go right on making the language I use is very fine. It encourages me to stick with it, whatever happens. If the machine will work, I tell myself, then you've got to work with it. That's what it amounts to. If you can't write a decent short story because of the cold, write something else. Write anything. Write a long letter to somebody. Tell them how cold you are. By the time the letter is received, the sun will be out again and you will be warm again, but the letter will be there, mentioning the cold. If it is so cold that you can't make up a little ordinary Tuesday prose, why, what the hell? Say something that comes along, just so it's the truth. Talk about your toes freezing, about the time you actually wanted to burn books to keep warm but couldn't do it, about the phonograph. Speak of the little unimportant things on a cold day, when your mind is numb and your feet and hands are frozen. Mention the things you wanted to write but couldn't. This is what I have been telling myself. After coffee this morning, I came here to write an important story. I was warm with the coffee, and I didn't realize how really cold it was. I brought out paper and started to line up what I was going to say in this important story that will never be written, because once I lose a thing, I lose it forever. The story that is forever lost because of the cold that got into me and silenced me and made me jump up from my chair and do bending exercises. Well, I can tell you about it. I can give you an idea what it was to have been like. I remember that much about it, but I didn't write it, and it is lost. It will give you something of an idea as to how I write. I will tell you the things I was telling myself this morning while I was getting the story lined up in my head. Think of America, I told myself this morning. The whole thing. The cities, all the houses, all the people, the coming and going, the coming of children, the going of them, the coming and going of men and death and life, the movement, the talk, the sound of machinery, the oratory. Think of the pain in America, and the fear, and the deep inward longing of all things alive in America. Remember the great machines, wheels turning, smoke and fire, the mines and the men working them, the noise, the confusion. Remember the newspapers and the moving picture theaters and everything that is a part of this life. Let this be your purpose, to suggest this great country. Then turn to the specific. Go out to some single person and dwell with him, within him, lovingly, seeking to understand the miracle of his being and utter the truth of his existence and reveal the splendor of the mere fact of his being alive, and say it in great prose. Simply show that he is of the time, of the machines and the fire and smoke, the newspapers and the noise. Go with him to his secret and speak of it gently, showing that it is a secret of man. Do not deceive. Do not make up lies for sake of pleasing anyone. No one need be killed in your story. Simply relate what it is great event of all history, of all time, the humble, artless truth of mere being. There is no greater theme. No one need be violent to help you with your art. There is violence. Mention it, of course, when it is time to mention it. Mention the war. Mention all ugliness, all waste. Do even this lovingly, but emphasize the glorious truth of mere being. It is the major theme. You do not have to create a triumphant climax. The man you write of need not perform some heroic or monstrous deed in order to make your prose great. Let him do what he has always done, day in, day out, continuing to live. Let him walk and talk and think and sleep and dream and awaken and walk again and talk again and move and be alive. It is enough. There's nothing else to write about. You've never seen a short story in life. The events of life have never fallen into the form of the short story, of the form of the poem, or into any other form. Your own consciousness is the only form you need. Your own awareness is the only action you need. Speak of this man. Recognize his existence. Speak of man. Well, this is a poor idea what the story was to have been like. I was warm with coffee when I was telling myself what and how to write, but now I am freezing, and this is the closest I can come to what I had in mind. It was to have been something fine, but now all that I have is the vague remembrance of the story. The least I can do is put into words this remembrance. Tomorrow I will write another story, a different story. I will look at the picture from a different viewpoint. I don't know for sure, but I may feel cocky, and I may mock this country and the life that is lived here. It is possible. I can do it. I have done it before, and sometimes when I get mad about political parties and political graft, I sit down and mock this great country of ours. I get mean, and I make man out to be a rotten, worthless, unclean thing. It isn't man, but I make out as if it is. It's something else, something less tangible. But for mockery, it is more convenient to make out that it is a man. It's my business to get at the truth, but when you start to mock, you say the hell with the truth. Nobody's telling the truth, why should I? Everybody's telling nice lies, writing nice stories and novels. Why should I worry about the truth? There is no truth, only grammar, punctuation, and all that rot. But I know better. I can get mad at things and start to mock, but I know better. At its best, the whole business is pretty sad, pretty pathetic. All day I've been in this room freezing, wanting to say something solid and clean about all of us who are alive. But it was so cold I couldn't do it. All I could do was swing my arms and smoke cigarettes and feel rotten. Early this morning, when I was warm with coffee, I had this great story in mind, ready to get into print, but it got away from me. The most I can say now is that it is very cold in San Francisco today, and I am freezing. Saroyan.